today, thank you. Today we will do a case study about Itamar Medical, and we'll look at it from a particular point of view, which is the how to select and work and network with strategics. Those are the large multinationals, enterprises that we want to work with because they bring value, of course, benefits and disadvantages. I'm Gilad Glick. I was Itamar Medical CEO for about 9 years until a year ago, and one of the founders of MCI. Pleasure having you here. Those that can, I'll appreciate if you open the camera so I can interact with you. That will be awesome. But if not, I understand as well. What we're trying to do typically is go through the case. I'll open the chat on the right side so Hannah can look at questions as they're raised, so you don't have to wait for the end to ask questions. And I'll pause every few slides and try to actually address them, because the dialogue sometimes is more important than the case study itself. Okay, cool. So let's start. Hannah, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen. Thank you.
You see the full screen or the presenter view?
The presenter view. No. You need, yeah.
Now?
No, not yet.
What
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, works?
Yeah.
Recording in progress.
Great.
Awesome. And then, of course, everybody, when you join, if as we go through the case study, if you can mute. So MCI, or Medtech Commercialization Institute, is based on the concept that commercializing medical device technologies, products, services, by the way, apply for digital health as well, mostly looking at the US market, has 15 basic elements that we need to think about and analyze and apply to our products and services in order to optimize commercialization. You can see the 15 elements here. We have webinars and a lot of case study around them, so you can watch them separately. Today, we will do a case study on Itamar looking at what we call the strategics mapping and networking. How can we engage? How can we select what type of strategics are relevant to our company? And how can we use them? When does it work? When does it work less? And what could be the potential benefits? Intertwine into it, of course, it's not, it has to be interacting with what we call the care pathway mapping, where in the patient journey those interaction can happen. And of course, in the end, how does it impact the call point? Because it's all about the type of doctors we're calling on and what type of sales force those strategic has. Okay, so that's the case study for today. I'll start with one really quick background, note. And Itamar Medical, publicly listed company, Tel Aviv and NASDAQ, manufactured that watch-like device, FDA medical grade diagnostic tool on label to diagnose disease called sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a disease impacting 1 in 4 adults in the West, with all kind of impact and symptoms like tiredness, daytime sleepiness.
Yeah. Sorry that I'm interrupting. There is somebody else that don't see the screen. I see it, but someone just write me that he cannot see it. Okay, so let's continue. I will check it on the side. Thank you.
Can you raise your hand, everybody, if you can see the slides? Raise your hand if you can see the slide. Yeah, I think that people can see the slide.
Great, thank you.
So we're talking about that device, diagnostic device for sleep apnea, manufactured by Itamar Medical, FDA cleared, and by the way, reimbursed. The problem, the unmet need, there believed to be 60 million Americans suffering from sleep apnea. As I said, 1 in 4 adults over the age of 40, with symptoms like daytime sleepiness, snoring, but also later on cardiovascular disease and cognitive disease. So it's a serious disease, chronic disease developed over time. And one of the big problems that Itamar tried to address was that 90% of them never been diagnosed. Let's think about why. And the first thing we did, and that's one of the modules of the MCI model, is mapping the care pathway, the patient journey, and try to understand some of the root cause and who plays in the different areas. So let's think about the journey of a sleep apnea patient. 60 million patient, all kind of backgrounds. They go to the doctor, they complain about the symptoms. I'm tired, I'm snoring, my significant other snores, I have palpitation in my heart, I'm falling asleep after lunch, I can't concentrate, all those type of symptoms of sleep apnea. They complain to their general practitioner, to the cardiologist, to the ENT, OBGYN, different type of physicians. Smart physicians, can think about it, realize it might be sleep apnea, and in a typical care pathway, they refer the patient to a sleep doctor. The problem is that there is only 5,000 sleep doctors in the US. Those sleep doctors, of course, immediately think that that's sleep apnea in most cases and refer the patient to diagnosis of sleep apnea so they can benefit from therapy. Historically, 80% of these patients went to sleep labs, which is an in-hospital or in-facility overnight polysomnography, so multiple testings, looks like what you see here. And they had their benefits, they could charge about $2,000 per night, and it was very comprehensive study with a lot of signals, great outcome. Well, Itamar received portion of it, about 20% of the patient was referred to what we call home sleep testing, which is taking a device home, like the Itamar watch with a probe, and getting similar results with some advantages and some disadvantages as always, but at the patient's home, supposedly opening the entire market for diagnosis because it's cheap and not limiting by a bed in the hospital. And once the diagnosis is complete, the sleep doc refer the patient to what we call DME, Durable Medical Equipment Service Provider. It's the equivalent of Yad Sarah in the US, but for profit. And that's where they'll get the therapy, which in most cases will be a CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure. Those CPAP were sold by two large companies, ResMed, based in San Diego, and Philips, which is a global multinational, large corporation, ResMed, which is solely a CPAP company, $3 billion in revenue, $32 billion in market cap. Philips as well, and they had similar size business. So that was the situation when we started to think about how to commercialize our product. I know it's very just the juice of what I could tell, but that the technology and everything else is not the case for today. So the first attempt was to go to those big two strategics, Philips and ResMed, and tell them, listen, guys, you're selling CPAPs, you're making, $2 to $3 billion in revenue by only diagnosing 10% of the potential population because of that bottleneck called in-lab polysomnography that doesn't diagnose enough patients that can benefit from the therapy. How about work with us? We'll collaborate either by you distributing us or doing some form of co-marketing, or never mind, we'll collaborate together. We'll diagnose more patients, and you'll end up selling more CPAPs. We can double, triple, quadruple your business together, really match made from heaven. And I tried for several times, and historically it didn't really work. You can see here the results. The only customer that picked up was Kaiser Permanente. They did not really wanted to be associated with this, and we started to understand why. And here is what we learned. First is that the big therapy companies, ResMed and Philips, were afraid to lead the change with their base customers because their base customers benefited from the in-lab. It was actually their main revenue source. Now, if I go back and you see here, the sleep doctors do not bill for the therapy. It's the DME companies that bill for the therapy. The sleep docs bills their diagnostic testing services. So the money source for those who make the decision benefited from that, barrier in the marketplace. And that's, by the way, globally, not just in the US. I see IRA here, it's the same in Japan, it's the same in Europe, it's the same in Germany, it's the same in France. It's very prevalent. So they had no interest to change the current status. And the big therapeutic companies was worried that if they will lead the change and associated with a disruptive change to their customers, they will suffer. They will be attacked by the customers. So they were worried about it. Okay, as I said, their base sleep doctors benefited from a $2,000 in-lab PSG. Home sleep testing billing is 10% of it, is $200. They were also convinced that the current in-lab technology works. They were trained by that technology. They studied at school, at their fellowship, at the, they practice it for years. Why to change if it works? And of course, the big therapeutic companies' employees themselves, the education people, the marketing people, they came from that in-lab polysomnography culture, and they were part of what, of the current status. So why to change if it really works? And practically we failed to engage with those strategic based on the sleep call point, the sleep doctor trying to change the behavior of the sleep doctors. So I'm going to do a pause, see if there are any questions. No question yet. Okay, very clear case, very typical. So it's not going to happen with the sleep large companies at the sleep call point. Later on, around 2014, we started to see a very interesting data coming in that sleep apnea is not only impacting how tired you are and your cognitive focus on how focused you can be and snoring, but actually there was correlation and later on causality with cardiovascular disease. So it started in 2010 with some large epidemiological studies showing that patients suffering from sleep apnea also have very high prevalence of cardiovascular disease. You can see here, AFib, hypertension, congestive heart failure, diabetes, stroke, etc. Later on, 2015, we started to see causality studies coming in, explaining why it's happening physiologically. And even later on, outcome studies start to come in. We were somewhat involved, but it was not all of our doing, but an opportunity was raised. Can we think about sleep apnea not as a sleep disease or lung disease, but as a cardiovascular risk factor, right? And that became very interesting case. So we came up with a business model. We said, here you go. Remember the care pathway I showed you before. We're going to change it. Instead of those 60 million patients that suffer from sleep apnea symptoms, we'll target 40 million patients that have cardiovascular disease, and sleep apnea might be a risk factor, just like hypertension or QT syndrome. Then instead of them coming from the general doctors referred to as sleep doctors, and the sleep doctors send them to a sleep lab, we'll have the cardiologist diagnose them at the cardiovascular call point, like they're sending them to ECG, like them sending them to blood pressure test. We'll send them to a sleep test. And if they have sleep apnea, it's a cardiovascular risk factor. At the cardiologist, we'll change it. And instead of 20% of the patient going to home and 80% to the lab, cardiologist will provide our device at the cardiovascular call point, send them home to be tested one night. Okay, and all those patients will be tested. Of course, it was a problem with the sleep doc, so we created a cloud-based platform that sleep doctors that want to collaborate with us can interpret the results using online type technology, which was not that breakthrough at the time. And when the diagnostic is confirmed, go to the DME. Okay, a new care pathway design, very innovative. And we went back to the Resmed and the Philips guys, said, listen, we have a solution. You don't have to bother your base customers, hide behind us. Let's work together. We'll call on the cardiologist. And the cardiologist will make the change, not the sleep doctors. Well, that didn't work as well. They were still worried. So we said, okay, our only other option is to go to the cardiology companies. And our first attempt, it's what I call the usual suspects. We talked to Medtronic, which was anyway 25% shareholder of Itamar Medical at the time. They had the board seat. Chris Cleary, the head of BD, sat at our board. We talked to Biosense Webster. I'm coming from Biosense Webster. I started my career 17 years at Biosense Webster. I knew all the doctors, all the people. We talked to Boston Scientific and Abbott, and all of them showed great interest. And the outcome was, you can see here in Globes, published in 17th of March 2014, that Itamar Medical closed the deal with Medtronic to co-market sleep apnea tests to cardiologists, in particular to EPs, right? Great opportunity right there. Well, we started to work, we started to engage with the sales force, creating tools, going to conventions and everything else. And after about a year and a half, 2 years into it, even less, we gave up. It didn't work. No engagement, no pickup. We didn't have impact on our business. So we analyzed what happened. The first thing we learned is that Medtronic AFib solution sales force called on what we call electrophysiologists, which is a subspecialty of cardiologists that do interventional procedure, catheterization. They were not seeing patients all day. They were ablating patients most of the day and see patients some of the days. So they were specialized. They were in the hospitals, and the sleep doctors at the hospital resisted their, changing the current care pathway. And hospitals could be political, as you all know, unlike a private practice. Those Medtronic salespeople used to transaction in the thousands of dollars, right? Each catheter is $2,000, $3,000. Systems are in $100,000. And then selling a $75 sleep test was considered peanuts for them. We couldn't really impact their compensation, their commission. It was too little for what they used to, okay? And of course, Medtronic didn't benefit from a top line perspective. So reps always said, we prefer to sell our own products and not somebody else's product because we make more money. It's not our preferred child. So there was, although leadership liked it, and head of BD liked it, and head of AF division liked it, the reps didn't support it from those reasons, and it didn't really work. So first call point failed, mostly because of type of the reps and type of the call point they were calling on. Hey, I want to see if there is any questions. I don't see the chat. Hannah, questions? Not so.
Oh.
Okay. So we went back to the drawing board and we said, okay, let's go back to those sleep companies and tell them, listen, as I said, let's do a separate business. We will communicate with the cardiologists, solve a problem, increase the number of CPAP you sell, and you don't worry about the sleep doctors, which is your base customers. So we start talking to them, ResMed, Philips, Fish and Paykel, and in summer 2018, actually it much materialized into what I call, don't try it at home, almost acquisition of Itamar by ResMed. It was not published because it was confidential, published later on, but we went through a full M&A process, including full due diligence. We had a non-binding term sheet. The PR was written. We got a goal valuation of $430 million to acquire the company. It almost worked. We went through the entire process. Ira here, he was experiencing it, maybe others. And in the last minute, really before we signed the binding term sheet, the deal failed. And I talked to Mick Farrell, the CEO of ResMed, about what happened. And in the end, they got cold feet again. Remember the same reason in the beginning. They got a cold feet from how the sleep doctors will react to them being involved with overcoming or trying to change the existing care pathway. So it failed. And it was, by the way, a big disaster to have as a CEO and leadership team, to have the entire company recovering from a almost completed M&A that failed. It's not a great experience to have. Again, as I said, don't try it at home. Okay, so we went back to the drawing board and we said, okay, if it doesn't work with the interventional cardiology large companies, and definitely we tried twice with the sleep companies, it didn't work. Who else can help us? And we found a bunch of companies that call on the general cardiologists. For example, biotelemetry that does home-based Holter ECG monitors, if you know, the Zio Patch. Welsh Elaine that sells to cardiologists everything from stethoscope to blood pressure cuffs. Zoll Medical that sells to general cardiologists a vest that defibrillate them if they have a ventricular fibrillation. And in May 2019, we signed an agreement with biotelemetry, the large ECG Holter monitor company, the largest at the time, to start work together. They will distribute Itamar to general cardiologists. They had the right call point. They had great similar business. It's service-based business in which they convince the doctors to prescribe Holter EKG monitors, and the patient will go home, which is very similar to what we do, right? And wear it and get the next morning or the next week or 14 days a recording of ECG. The transaction size was very similar to us. It was $100 for a Holter per night or per recording, while we were 75, so similar type of transaction. They had what we call IDTF, independent diagnostic testing facilities, so they knew how to bill for those home testings in ECG, EKG, but not from sleep, but it was a very short distance to get to sleep, and they had a very large sales force, and practically it started to work really well. We've seen the light. Biotelemetry we had a great collaboration with them. We started to move the needle. We started seeing the results, and then life happens, and Philips bought them for $2.8 billion around December of 2020, and the deal was off. That happens too. So the right strategic, but life intervene. As we said, human has plans, and somebody else is laughing. And that we found ourselves without a deal because Philips stops the collaboration, because Philips had a sleep business. So not so nice. However, we continued with Zoll here, the defibrillation, external defibrillation company. We started to work with them. And I think in the end, it was the right call point, the right transaction size, the right sales force, the right everything. So it ended up with an acquisition. And somewhere around late September 2021, Zoll Medical announced that they will acquire Itamar Medical for $538 million. And all those attempts ended up with a happy ending. And we know today that it really works. Revenues are increasing, and that deal is materializing itself in a nice way. So after 4 attempts, the last one with the right call point, with the right strategic, actually worked and ended up in an exit. That's the learning here. And that's the case study. We have 5 minutes to 7 minutes for questions, and let's hear them. If not, I'll just make a conclusion. Any questions?
Yeah, so Gilad, there is a question from Limor here. So how early can you identify who is going to pay and who is the decision maker, and how is doing it when you are in early stage with limited research, separating time, money, etc.?
Yeah, Limor, great question. I think looking at Itamar and now looking at the many startup companies I'm involved with as an investor from J&J, it's almost never too early. Once you have a product and the product is ready to go to market or starting to go to market, you start thinking, you start analyzing who are the relevant strategics. It doesn't mean you have to engage with them, but you have to start thinking about them and analyzing in the concept of the 15 elements, right? What is the difference between the call point you want and their call point? What type of transaction? What type of supportive elements are required? Like, for instance, an IDTF in our case. So really thinking, what they are and starting building those relationships. A relationship that it doesn't take much resources. It definitely takes time and bandwidth, but not money. When is the right time to trigger a deal? I would say at least when your product was tried and you have enough feedback to know you're not going to fail on the design. Because once strategics tried to distribute your product and the feedback from customers is not great, they will get cold feet, and it will be really difficult to regain that. So wait for maturity of the product. Once the product is mature and you have reimbursement and you have some of those elements, FDA definitely, that's the right time to actually engage with the strategics. Other questions? I actually can see the questions.
Great.
I can see the questions, Hannah. So how can you try and predict those issues ahead of time? Well, tough, but at least let's learn from what we did today. So yes, if you can please mute, that would be great. But let's see what we learned from this case. Making sure the call point is relevant. In our case study here, I tried first to look at my comfort zone, right? What I belong to from my history, which is the interventional cardiologist. And it was a mistake because that's not where in the care pathway that technology belonged. And later we went to the general cardiologist, we could see it, but the comfort of going to what I know was too tempting, and Medtronic was on my board and was shareholder. So all the comfort was there at the interventional cardiologist call point, but it was wrong analytically and it failed. So that type of thinking, looking at the 15 elements and then thinking which strategic fits those 15 elements is really important. Okay, I got a thank you. Looking back, what could be done differently? Could you send a presentation? So the presentation is recorded. We're not sending hard copies, but you can watch the recorded webinar. And definitely the 15 elements presentation are available on the MNE Commercialization Institute website. Do you think you would do anything differently now that US healthcare system is geared more towards value-based care? Try pitching rebirth. Okay, well, that's a question around the value-based care. I think value-based care is an important trend, but it's still very minor part of how the healthcare system in the US actually works. It's majorly transactional. So while I will think about value-based model, I will focus in the next at least 1 to 2 years on just the traditional transactional business, because that's how most people do business. We tried later on to quantify the benefit of treating cardiovascular patient for sleep apnea and reducing the healthcare cost. We conducted a study. We actually published the study in a peer-reviewed journal article, went to the payers and tried to convince them, and they were not convinced. They were not convinced because they thought in their mind that the therapy, CPAP, is not mature enough for that type of model, although the evidence was great, and decided not to engage. So our demonstrated value didn't engage them to this. Could be different things. We went back to transactional, and transactional worked. Can you please share the link to the website? Hannah, can you share a link to the website, MCI website?
Yeah, I sent it in the chat. It's already here.
Great. And also, where can you watch the recording? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so those who want the recorded meetings, just send me an email. I will send the address mail, and I will send it to you.
Perfect. Question: will you be using AI to alleviate any overhead or direct patient treatment of healthcare cost reduction and more affordable and accessible options for patients? I think that's a very general question. If you ask me, if I have to be specific, can AI replace like a device to diagnose sleep apnea? I would say that's not the point, because it's so easy to diagnose them. If we make it easier, it won't change the picture here. What really can change the picture is more effective therapy for sleep apnea and changing physicians' behavior. As you know, neuromodulation therapy for sleep apnea is progressing really quickly. Implantable neuromodulation, companies like Inspire Medical, valued at $7 billion right now and growing extremely fast, are the future. And I think CPAP is the results of it's the therapy of the past, and that might change the whole approach, but we'll see. Have you ever thought about going D2C? Yes, not only thought, we tried. We signed an agreement with a direct-to-consumer company in the sleep apnea space out of New Heavens. It was a disaster. And the reason it was a disaster, because what we learned is that if consumers, patients, have a reimbursed alternative to doing something medically, they will always gravitate to the reimbursed option versus paying out of pocket. So that was the hard learning, and we had an $8 million deal with a company I won't mention, but it's published, so you can see it online. And they were unable to solve the conflict of the patients that they could get the same thing for free. Those who are interested, that is Hannah, and just wanted to say thank you. Great, thank you very much. And we're on the dot. It's 10:30. Wish you guys great day. Thank you for joining. Reflect on what I said. Think about it. Strategics are critical to a success of a medtech startups, but they can also take tons of energy if they're not the right ones, as I've experienced myself. So analyze, think, and in the end, try and error is the best way. I wish everybody a good day.
Thank you very much.